In August of 1105, on a sun-scorched plain 15 miles from the sea, 500 knights in shining armor faced down an Egyptian army 4 times their size in a battle that would decide whether the Kingdom of Jerusalem would survive its first decade. And our silver-armored good knight stood in the front ranks as the fate of the Latin East hung on the edge of a lance. This wasn't just another border skirmish. This was the third and final time the Fatimid Caliphate would dare to challenge the Crusaders in open battle at Ramla, the strategic crossroads that controlled the road to Jerusalem itself. Watch as King Baldwin I, haunted by the catastrophic defeat of 1102, where half his knights were slaughtered, executes the most sophisticated combined arms battle of his career, holding his nerve under a rain of arrows, personally charging Turkish horse archers threatening his rear, and then leading the final thunderous cavalry assault that shattered the Egyptian center in hours of the most brutal, bloody melee the Levant had yet seen. From the psychological power of the true cross carried into battle as a divine standard, to the tactical evolution that transformed reckless Frankish aggression into disciplined, coordinated warfare, every moment of this epic tale shaped the survival of Christendom in the East. Subscribe to the GoodKnight Stories for more immersive historical journeys that transport you to the dust, heat, and violence of medieval battlefields, where our eternal knight in silver armor guides you through the rise and fall of kingdoms with storytelling designed for deep focus, relaxation, or peaceful sleep. Comment below which Crusader battle you'd like the good knight to witness next. But for now, settle in, relax, and journey back to that scorching August day in 1105, when the future of Jerusalem was decided on the plains of Ramla. Chapter 1. The Weight of Memory. The good knight had learned to measure time not by the turning of seasons, but by the weight of scars. Some were visible, the puckered line along his left forearm, where a Fatimid lance had found the gap between vambrace and rerebrace 3 years prior. Others were deeper, etched not into flesh, but into the fabric of memory itself. The plains of Ramla carried both kinds of scars. It was the 27th day of August in the year of our Lord 1105, and the sun had barely crested the eastern hills when the good knight felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the sensation that always preceded battle. He stood in the pre-dawn darkness outside the walls of Jaffa, 15 miles west of Ramla, watching as the other knights of the kingdom prepared their mounts and checked their equipment with the methodical precision of men who knew that a loose strap or a forgotten buckle could mean the difference between life and a shallow grave in the sand. The air was already warm. By midday, it would be a furnace. He ran his hand along the flank of his destrier, a massive iron-grey warhorse bred for strength rather than speed. The animal's coat was slick with sweat despite the early hour. The beast knew what was coming. Horses always did. They could smell the tension in their riders, could sense the collective anxiety of 500 armored men preparing to ride toward an enemy that outnumbered them 4 to 1. The good knight's armor gleamed silver in the torchlight. It was a hauberk of interlinked chainmail that fell to his knees, each ring painstakingly riveted closed by an armorer in Jerusalem who had learned his trade in the forges of Normandy. Over the mail he wore a surcoat of undyed linen, a recent innovation adopted from the local Christians who had lived under Muslim rule before the Crusaders arrived. The cloth served a dual purpose. It reflected the brutal Levantine sun and prevented the metal rings from heating to the point where they would brand his skin with their touch. He had learned that lesson the hard way during his first summer in Outremer. The land had a way of teaching such lessons to those who survived long enough to learn them. Around him, the other knights were engaged in the same rituals of preparation. Some prayed quietly, their lips moving in silent recitation of the Paternoster or the Ave Maria. Others checked and rechecked their equipment with an obsessive focus that bordered on superstition. A few stood in small groups, speaking in low voices about the battle to come, about the enemy they would face, about the odds of survival. The good knight did not join them. He had learned long ago that words before battle were often wasted breath. What mattered was the discipline of preparation, the mental fortitude to face what was coming, and the faith, whether in God or in the strength of one's own arm, to step forward when the moment arrived. He thought of the Second Battle of Ramla. It had been 3 years since that disaster, but the memory remained vivid. May of 1102. King Baldwin I, confident and aggressive, had received reports of a Fatimid raiding party near Ramla. The intelligence had been faulty, catastrophically so. What Baldwin believed to be a minor skirmish force was, in fact, a massive Egyptian army. The king had ridden out with only 200 knights and no infantry, expecting an easy victory. Instead, he had ridden into a slaughter. The good knight had not been present for that battle. He had been stationed at the northern frontier, guarding against incursions from Damascus, but he had heard the stories. Every knight in the kingdom had heard the stories. Stephen of Blois, one of the great lords of the First Crusade, cut down in the melee. Stephen of Burgundy, killed trying to rally a defense. 200 knights reduced to a handful of survivors. Baldwin himself forced to hide in a tower at Ramla, then to flee under cover of darkness to the coastal fortress of Arsur, riding through enemy-held territory with only a few companions. Half the kingdom's heavy cavalry had died in a single afternoon because of bad intelligence and overconfidence. The lesson had been brutal and absolute. In Outremer, a single mistake could end everything. Now, 3 years later, the Fatimids were back. And this time, Baldwin was taking no chances. The good knight heard the sound of hooves on stone and turned to see a rider approaching, a sergeant in the livery of the king, his face dust-streaked and exhausted. The man dismounted and immediately sought out the senior knights, delivering his report in a voice loud enough to carry across the assembled host. "The Egyptians are at Ramla, 6,000 men, perhaps more. Sudanese infantry, Arab and Berber cavalry, and Turks, horse archers from Damascus under the command of General Sabawa. They've made camp on the plain east of the town." A murmur rippled through the assembled knights. The presence of Turkish horse archers changed everything. The Sudanese and the Egyptian cavalry were known quantities. Dangerous, professional, but predictable. The Turks were something else entirely. They fought with composite bows from horseback, using hit-and-run tactics that could shred an infantry formation or provoke a cavalry charge into a disorganized pursuit. They were the reason the First Crusade had nearly failed at Dorylaeum. They were the nightmare that every Frankish commander feared. The good knight felt the tightness in his chest increase. This would not be a simple battle. This would be a test of discipline, of coordination, of the ability to hold formation under fire and to strike only when the moment was right. King Baldwin I emerged from the command tent as the first light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky in shades of pale gold and rose. He was a tall man, lean and hard, with the sun-darkened skin of someone who had spent years in the Levant. His eyes were sharp, constantly moving, assessing, calculating. He wore a hauberk similar to the good knight's, though his surcoat bore the golden cross of Jerusalem. Baldwin did not waste time with speeches. He was not a man given to grand rhetoric. Instead, he spoke plainly, his voice carrying the weight of experience and the cold pragmatism of a leader who had learned his lessons in blood. "We march to Ramla. The Egyptians have brought an army to take Jerusalem. We will stop them. You know the ground. You know the enemy. You know what is at stake." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the assembled knights. 3 years ago, we lost half our strength because we underestimated the enemy. We will not make that mistake again. We will march in formation. We will hold our discipline. and when the time comes, we will strike with everything we have. The Turks will try to flank us. The Sudanese will try to hold us in place. Our job is to break their center before they can surround us." Another pause. The silence was absolute. "The true cross rides with us today. God is with us. But God helps those who keep their formation and follow orders. Mount. Up! We ride within the hour." The good knight swung into the saddle, feeling the familiar weight of his armor settle across his shoulders and back. The destrier shifted beneath him, powerful muscles bunching and releasing. Around him, the other knights were mounting as well, the sound of metal on metal and leather on leather creating a symphony of preparation. As the column began to form, the good knight caught sight of the true cross being brought forward. It was encased in gold and silver, carried by a bishop in white vestments, flanked by a guard of the kingdom's most veteran sergeants. The relic gleamed in the early morning light, a tangible symbol of divine favor and a rallying point for men who were about to face overwhelming odds. The good knight was not a man given to overt displays of piety, but he felt the weight of the moment. The true cross was more than a symbol. It was a promise that this land, this kingdom, was worth dying for, that the blood spilled on these plains had meaning, that the struggle was not in vain. He touched the hilt of his sword, feeling the worn leather grip beneath his gauntleted hand, and whispered a prayer that was more habit than conscious thought. Then the column began to move, and the time for prayer was over. Chapter 2. The Road to Ramla. The march from Jaffa to Ramla was 15 miles, a distance that could be covered in a few hours by a fast-moving cavalry force. But Baldwin was not leading a fast-moving cavalry force. He was leading an army, 500 knights, 2,000 infantry, and a baggage train that carried the supplies necessary to sustain a prolonged engagement. Speed was secondary to cohesion. A scattered army was a dead army. The good knight rode in the second rank of the heavy cavalry, positioned near the center of the column. Around him were men he had fought beside for years, veterans of the First Crusade, younger knights who had been born in Outremer, and a handful of recent arrivals from Europe who still carried the wide-eyed intensity of men who had not yet learned to fear the desert sun. The road to Ramla followed the ancient Via Maris, the Way of the Sea, a trade route that had connected Egypt to the Levant for millennia. It was a hard-packed dirt road, wide, enough for a column of cavalry to ride 4 abreast, flanked on either side by low scrub and the occasional olive grove. To the east, the land rose gradually toward the Judean highlands. To the west, the Mediterranean shimmered in the distance, a band of blue that promised escape if everything went wrong. The good knight had ridden this road many times. It was the lifeline of the kingdom, the artery that connected the port of Jaffa to the capital at Jerusalem. If the Fatimids controlled Ramla, they controlled this road. And if they controlled this road, Jerusalem would be cut off from the sea, starved of supplies and reinforcements, vulnerable to siege. That was why Ramla mattered. That was why they were riding toward an enemy that outnumbered them 4-1. The sun climbed higher, and the heat began to build. The good knight felt the sweat begin to trickle down his back, soaking into the padded gambesson he wore beneath his mail. The surcoat helped, but it could only do so much. By mid-morning, the temperature would be unbearable. By midday, it would be a test of endurance just to remain conscious inside the metal shell of his armor. He glanced at the men around him. Some were already showing signs of strain, faces flushed, breathing labored. The younger knights especially were struggling. They had not yet learned the rhythm of the march, the way to conserve energy and ration water, the mental discipline required to push through discomfort and focus on the task ahead. The good knight had learned those lessons years ago. He rode with his visor raised, allowing what little breeze there was to cool his face. He drank sparingly from his water skin, knowing that the real test would come later, when the battle began, and there would be no time to drink, no time to rest, no time for anything except the brutal, grinding work of staying alive. As the column approached Ramla, the landscape began to change. The scrub gave way to open fields, and the ground became harder, sandier. This was the Plain of Sharon, a broad expanse of relatively flat terrain that was ideal for cavalry operations. It was also ideal for the kind of large-scale battle that Baldwin was preparing to fight. The town of Ramla itself was visible in the distance, a cluster of low buildings surrounded by a modest wall. It had been a prosperous market town before the Crusaders arrived, a nexus of trade between the coast and the interior. Now it was a contested frontier, a place that had seen 3 major battles in as many years. The GoodKnight could see the dust cloud before he could see the enemy. It rose from the plain east of Ramla, a vast, churning haze that marked the presence of thousands of men and horses. The Fatimid army had made camp there, and they were waiting. Baldwin called a halt a mile from the town. The column came to a stop, and the knights dismounted to rest their horses and prepare for the battle to come. The infantry formed up in their dense, rectangular fighting box formation, a mobile fortress of spears and shields that would serve as the anchor for the entire army. The GoodKnight dismounted and led his destrier to the side of the road, allowing the animal to drink from a trough that had been set up by the baggage train. He checked his equipment one final time: lance, sword, dagger, shield. Everything was in order. Everything was ready. He looked toward the dust cloud and tried to estimate the size of the enemy force. 6,000, the scout had said. Perhaps more. The GoodKnight had fought against those odds before, but never with the added complication of Turkish horse archers. The Turks changed the equation. They made it impossible to simply charge forward and rely on the weight of the heavy cavalry to break the enemy line. They required a more sophisticated approach, one that Baldwin, to his credit, seemed to understand. The king was moving among the knights now, speaking quietly with his senior commanders. The GoodKnight could not hear the words, but he could see the gestures, the pointing toward the enemy position, the tracing of lines in the dirt. Baldwin was planning something. The question was whether the plan would survive contact with the enemy. It never did. But that was the nature of battle. After a brief rest, the order came to remount. The column began to move again, this time in a more deliberate formation. The infantry formed the center, a dense block of 2,000 men bristling with spears. The heavy cavalry was divided into 3 divisions, one on each flank and one held in reserve, under Baldwin's personal command. The true cross was positioned in the center of the infantry, a golden beacon that would serve as the rallying point if the line began to break. The GoodKnight was assigned to the right flank, under the command of a grizzled veteran named Hugh of Tiberias. Hugh was a man of few words and fewer illusions. He had survived the First Crusade, the battles of 1101 and 1102, and a dozen smaller engagements. He knew how to fight, and more importantly, he knew how to keep his men alive. As the Crusader army advanced onto the plain, the Fatimid forces began to deploy. The GoodKnight could see them now, thousands of men forming up in a long, curved line that stretched across the width of the plain. The center was dominated by the Sudanese infantry, dense blocks of spearmen and archers in white and yellow tunics. On the flanks were the Arab and Berber cavalry, lighter and more mobile than the Frankish knights, armed with lances and javelins. And behind them, moving in loose, fluid formations, were the Turks, 1,300 horse archers, whose presence turned this from a straightforward battle into a deadly chess match. The GoodKnight felt his heart begin to pound. This was the moment before the storm, the brief, crystalline instant when everything was still possible, when the outcome had not yet been decided. He could feel the tension in the air, the collective breath of 500 knights and 2,000 infantry, all waiting for the signal to begin. Baldwin raised his hand, and the Crusader army came to a halt. The two forces faced each other across a quarter-mile of open ground, separated by nothing but dust and heat and the weight of history. The good knight lowered his visor, and the world narrowed to a slit of light. He could hear his own breathing, loud and rhythmic inside the confines of his helmet. He could feel the weight of his lance in his hand, the solid presence of his shield on his left arm, the powerful muscles of his destrier coiled and ready beneath him. And then, from the Fatimid line, came the first volley of arrows. The arrows came in waves, black streaks against the pale sky, arcing high and then plummeting down toward the Crusader line. The good knight heard the hiss of their passage, the sharp crack as they struck shields, the dull thud as they embedded themselves in the ground. A few found gaps in the armor. A horse screamed and went down, thrashing in the dust. A sergeant clutched at his shoulder where a shaft had punched through his mail. But the line held. The Frankish infantry raised their shields in an overlapping wall, creating a barrier that absorbed the worst of the volleys. The knights, protected by their heavy mail and the shields carried by their squires, endured the rain of arrows with grim patience. This was the price of facing the Sudanese bowmen, professional soldiers who had trained for years in the art of massed archery. The good knight sat motionless in his saddle, trusting in his armor and in the discipline of the men around him. An arrow glanced off his shoulder, the impact, jarring but not penetrating. Another struck his shield with enough force to split the wood, but the metal boss held. He did not flinch. To flinch was to invite panic, and panic was death. The Crusader crossbowmen and archers returned fire, their bolts and shafts cutting into the Sudanese ranks. The crossbow was a slower weapon than the composite bow, but it hit harder, and it required less training to use effectively. The Frankish archers were not as numerous as their Fatimid counterparts, but they were disciplined, and they aimed for the gaps in the enemy formation where the officers and standard-bearers stood. The missile duel continued for what felt like an eternity, but was likely no more than 20 minutes. It was a brutal, grinding exchange, a test of endurance and morale. Men died on both sides, not in the dramatic, heroic fashion of a cavalry charge, but in the slow, agonizing way of soldiers who bled out in the dust while the battle raged around them. And then the Turks began to move. The good knight saw them first as a blur of motion on the periphery of his vision. Horsemen moving fast, too fast, sweeping wide around the Crusader flanks. They were not charging directly at the line. Instead, they were circling, probing, looking for weaknesses. And as they moved, they fired, short, powerful bows that could punch through mail at close range, loosed from the saddle with a speed and accuracy that seemed almost supernatural. The Turkish horse archers were the most feared light cavalry in the world, and with good reason. They could ride and shoot simultaneously, using the momentum of their horses to increase the power of their shots. They could feint and retreat, drawing an enemy into a pursuit and then turning to unleash a devastating volley. They were the wolves of the battlefield, and they were circling the Crusader army like prey. Hugh of Tiberias shouted an order, and the right flank of the Crusader cavalry shifted, angling to meet the Turkish threat. The good knight felt his destrier respond to the pressure of his knees, turning to face the new danger. Around him, the other knights were doing the same, forming a defensive line that would prevent the Turks from getting behind the infantry. But the Turks were not interested in a direct engagement. They swept past the Crusader flank, loosing a volley of arrows as they went, and then wheeled away before the knights could respond. It was a classic harassment tactic, designed to provoke a charge or to wear down the enemy's morale. The good knight felt the frustration building. This was not the kind of fight he had trained for. The heavy cavalry was designed to deliver a single, overwhelming blow, a concentrated charge that would shatter an enemy formation through sheer momentum and violence. But the Turks refused to stand still. They were like smoke, impossible to grasp, always just out of reach. And while the Turks harassed the flanks, the Sudanese infantry continued their steady advance in the center. The Fatimid battle plan was becoming clear. Pin the Crusaders in place with the infantry, use the Turks to threaten the flanks and rear, and then grind the Frankish army down through attrition. It was a sound plan, and it was working. The GoodKnight could see the strain beginning to show in the Crusader line. The infantry were holding, but they were being pressed from two sides. The knights on the flanks were being forced to divide their attention between the Sudanese advance and the Turkish harassment. And the heat, the relentless, suffocating heat, was taking its toll. Men were collapsing inside their armor, overcome by exhaustion and dehydration. The GoodKnight's own breathing was labored. The inside of his helmet was a furnace, and the sweat was pouring down his face, stinging his eyes. His mouth was dry, his tongue thick. He wanted to drink, but there was no time. The Turks were coming around again, and this time they were closer. He raised his shield just in time to deflect an arrow that would have taken him in the throat. The impact sent a shock up his arm, and he felt the wood splinter further. Another hit, maybe two, and the shield would be useless. Around him, other knights were not so lucky. A man, too. His left took an arrow in the eye slit of his helmet and toppled from his saddle without a sound. A horse went down, its rider thrown clear but stunned, vulnerable. The Turks were taking a toll, and they had not even committed to a full engagement yet. And then, from the rear of the Crusader line, came the sound of shouting. The GoodKnight could not see what was happening, but he could hear the alarm in the voices. The Turks had gotten behind the infantry. They were threatening the baggage train, the supply wagons, the true cross itself. If the rear collapsed, the entire army would be surrounded. And if they were surrounded, they would be annihilated. The GoodKnight felt a cold knot of fear in his stomach. This was how the Second Battle of Ramla had begun, with the Crusaders surrounded, cut off, overwhelmed. This was the nightmare that every knight in the kingdom carried with them. But then, cutting through the chaos, came a new sound, the blast of a war horn, clear and commanding, and with it, a single word, shouted by 100 voices at once, "Baldwin!" The king was moving. King Baldwin I had spent the first phase of the battle exactly where a commander should be, at the center of his line, observing, calculating, waiting for the moment when his intervention would matter most. He had watched the Turks circle his flanks. He had seen the strain in his infantry as they endured the Sudanese advance. And he had recognized, with the cold clarity of a veteran, that the battle was on the verge of slipping away. The Turkish threat to the rear was not a feint. It was a genuine attempt to collapse the Crusader position from behind, to create panic and disorder, to turn a disciplined army into a mob of fleeing men. If Baldwin allowed that to happen, the battle, and the kingdom, would be lost. So he did the only thing he could do. He took his reserve, the 3rd Division of Heavy Cavalry, the best and most experienced knights in the army, and he led them personally toward the rear. The GoodKnight, still engaged on the right flank, could not see the king's charge, but he could hear it, the thunder of hooves, the roar of voices, the clash of steel on steel, and he could feel the shift in the battle, the way the pressure on the flanks suddenly eased as the Turks were forced to respond to the new threat. Baldwin's charge into the rear was not a wild, reckless assault. It was a calculated maneuver, designed to trap the Turkish horse archers against the terrain and neutralize their mobility. The Turks were fast, but they were also lightly armored. In a close-quarters melee, they were vulnerable. And Baldwin, for all his faults, was a master of the close-quarters melee. The king led his knights in a tight wedge, driving straight into the heart of the Turkish formation. The impact was devastating. Horses collided, men were thrown from their saddles, lances punched through leather and flesh. The Turks, caught off guard by the sudden aggression, tried to scatter, but there was nowhere to go. The Crusader infantry had closed ranks behind them, cutting off their escape. For 10 brutal minutes, the rear of the battlefield became a slaughterhouse. The knights hacked and stabbed with swords and maces, their heavy armor allowing them to absorb blows that would have killed a lighter-armed opponent. The Turks fought back with desperation, using their bows at point-blank range, slashing with curved sabers. But they were outmatched. The weight and momentum of the Frankish charge was too much. General Sabawa, the Turkish commander, tried to rally his men, but it was too late. The formation had broken, and once a formation broke, it was nearly impossible to restore. The surviving Turks fled toward the main Fatimid line, leaving behind hundreds of dead and wounded. Baldwin did not pursue. He had achieved his objective. The rear was secure. Now he had to regroup and prepare for the next phase of the battle. He wheeled his knights around and began the slow, disciplined march back toward the center of the Crusader line. The good knight, still on the right flank, felt the shift in momentum. The pressure from the Turks had evaporated. The harassment had stopped. And for the first time since the battle began, the Crusader army had room to breathe. Hugh of Tiberias seized the moment. He shouted an order, and the right flank of the cavalry began to reform, tightening their ranks, preparing for the next move. The good knight guided his destrier back into position, feeling the animal's exhaustion in the sluggish response. The horse had been standing in the sun for hours, enduring the heat and the tension, and it was beginning to falter. But there was no time to rest. The battle was entering its final phase. The Sudanese infantry, seeing the Turkish retreat, hesitated. Their advance slowed, and gaps began to appear in their line. The Fatimid commanders, positioned behind the infantry, were shouting orders, trying to restore cohesion, but the damage had been done. The psychological impact of Baldwin's charge had rippled through the entire enemy army. And Baldwin, ever the opportunist, recognized the opening. The king returned to the center of the Crusader line, his armor dented and bloodied, his face flushed with exertion. He did not pause to rest. Instead, he raised his sword high, the blade catching the sunlight, and he shouted a single word that every knight in the army had been waiting to hear. Charge! The charge of the heavy cavalry was the defining moment of medieval warfare, the culmination of years of training, the ultimate expression of knightly valor, and the single most terrifying sight on any battlefield. It was not a fast sprint. It was a slow, building crescendo of power and momentum, a wall of iron and horseflesh that accelerated from a walk to a trot to a canter to a full, thunderous gallop. The good knight felt the shift in his destrier as the animal responded to the collective movement of the formation. The horse's muscles bunched and released, and the ground began to blur beneath the pounding hooves. Around him, the other knights were lowering their lances, the long wooden shafts angling forward, the steel tips gleaming. The distance between the Crusader line and the Sudanese infantry closed with terrifying speed. 500 yards, 400, 300. The good knight could see the faces of the enemy now. Dark-skinned men in white tunics, their expressions a paka, mixture of determination and fear. They knew what was coming. They had seen it before, but knowing and experiencing were two different things. 200 yards. The Crusader line was a single, unified mass now, moving as one. The sound was deafening. The thunder of hooves, the rattle of armor, the roar of voices shouting war cries in a dozen different languages. The good knight's own voice joined the chorus, a wordless bellow that was part prayer, part defiance, part release of the tension that had been building for hours. 100 yards. The Sudanese infantry braced themselves, planting their spears in the ground, angling the shafts upward to meet the charge. It was a desperate tactic, one that might stop a few horses, but would not stop the charge itself. The momentum was too great. The weight was too much. 50 yards. The good knight could see the individual details now. The sweat on the faces of the Sudanese soldiers, the way their hands gripped their spears, the slight tremor in the line as men realized that they were about to be hit by a force that could not be stopped. And then, impact. The good knight's lance struck a Sudanese shield with enough force to shatter both the shield and the lance. The shock of the impact traveled up his arm, numbing his shoulder. But he did not let go. He drove forward, using the broken shaft as a battering ram, and then he was through the first line, into the heart of the enemy formation. His destrier trampled men beneath its hooves, the animal's training and instinct taking over. The good knight drew his sword, a long, double-edged blade that had been forged in the workshops of Jerusalem, and he began to hack at the men around him. There was no finesse, no technique, just brutal, mechanical violence. Slash, stab, parry, slash again. The world narrowed to a tunnel of motion and blood. Around him, the other knights were doing the same. The charge had punched a hole in the Sudanese line, and now the Crusaders were exploiting that hole, widening it, turning it into a breach. The Sudanese infantry, professional and disciplined, tried to hold, but the weight of the charge was too much. Men were being crushed, trampled, cut down. The line began to buckle. But the Sudanese did not break immediately. They were veterans, soldiers who had fought in a dozen campaigns, and they knew how to absorb a charge. They fell back in good order, reforming their ranks, using their spears to keep the knights at bay. And as the initial momentum of the charge began to fade, the battle devolved into a grinding, chaotic melee. The good knight found himself surrounded by enemies. His destrier was bleeding from a dozen cuts, its movements sluggish. His sword arm was numb, his breathing ragged. He could feel the heat inside his armor, the suffocating, crushing weight of the metal that was both his protection and his prison. A Sudanese spearman lunged at him, the point of the spear aimed at his horse's chest. The good knight twisted in the saddle, deflecting the blow with his shield, and then brought his sword down in a brutal overhead chop that split the man's skull. Blood sprayed across his surcoat, hot and sticky. Another enemy appeared, this one armed with a curved saber. The man was fast, darting in and out, slashing at the good knight's legs, trying to hamstring his horse. The good knight kicked out, his armored boot catching the man in the chest and sending him sprawling. Before the man could rise, another knight rode over him, the destrier's hooves crushing ribs and spine. The melee continued for what felt like hours, but was likely no more than 30 minutes. It was a test of endurance, of will, of the ability to keep fighting when every muscle screamed for rest. The good knight's world had shrunk to a few square yards of blood-soaked ground, a space defined by the reach of his sword and the stamina of his horse. And then, slowly, the Sudanese line began to crack. It started with a single unit, a block of spearmen on the left flank who, seeing the Turkish retreat and the relentless pressure of the Frankish knights, decided that survival was more important than honor. They broke ranks and began to run, and once the first unit broke, others followed. Panic, like fire, spread quickly. The good knight saw the shift and felt a surge of grim satisfaction. The battle was not over, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Sudanese infantry, the backbone of the Fatimid army, was collapsing. King Baldwin, still in the thick of the fighting, saw the same thing. He rallied his reserve knights, the men who had fought in the rear and were now bloodied but still capable, and he led them in one final push. This was the moment that would decide everything. If the Crusaders could break the Fatimid center completely, the entire enemy army would rout. If they failed, the battle would drag on, and exhaustion would claim them all. Baldwin's final charge was not as dramatic as the first. The horses were tired, the men were exhausted, and the ground was slick with blood. But it was enough. The Sudanese center, already wavering, shattered under the impact. Men threw down their weapons and fled, streaming back toward the safety of Ascalon, 30 miles to the southwest. The Arab and Berber cavalry, seeing the infantry collapse, made the pragmatic decision to withdraw. They were not cowards. They were professionals who understood that a lost battle was not worth dying for. They disengaged in good order, covering the retreat of the infantry, and began the long march back to Egypt. The good knight did not pursue. His destrier was on the verge of collapse, and he himself was barely able to remain in the saddle. He watched as the Fatimid army dissolved into a fleeing mob, and he felt nothing. No triumph, no joy, only a bone-deep exhaustion and a vague sense of relief that he had survived another day. Around him, the other knights were in similar condition. Some had dismounted and were sitting in the dust, too tired to move. Others were tending to wounded horses or checking on fallen comrades. The battlefield was a scene of carnage. Bodies piled in heaps, the ground churned into a muddy paste of blood and sand, the air thick with the smell of death. The true cross, still standing in the center of the Crusader line, gleamed in the afternoon sun. It had not fallen. The kingdom had not fallen. The battle was over. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when the good knight finally dismounted. His legs nearly gave out beneath him, the muscles cramped and trembling from hours in the saddle. He caught himself against his destrier's flank, feeling the animal's labored breathing, the heat radiating from its body. The horse had carried him through the charge, through the melee, through the grinding horror of the battle's climax. It had done everything asked of it, and more. The good knight ran his hand along the animal's neck, feeling the cuts and scrapes, the places where Sudanese spears had found flesh. The horse would live, but it would need weeks of rest and care. Around him, the Crusader army was beginning the grim work of the aftermath. Squires and sergeants moved among the wounded, separating those who could be saved from those who could not. The screams of the dying mixed with the prayers of the priests, creating a soundscape that was somehow worse than the battle itself. The good knight removed his helmet, and the rush of cool air against his face was almost painful. His hair was plastered to his skull with sweat, and his face was streaked with dust and blood, some his own, most not. He drank deeply from his waterskin, the liquid tasting of leather and metal, but more precious than wine. Hugh of Tiberias appeared beside him, his own armor dented and bloodied. The older knight's face was grey with exhaustion, but his eyes were sharp. "You fought well," Hugh said simply. The good knight nodded. Words seemed inadequate, unnecessary. They had both survived. That was enough. "Casualties?" the good knight asked. "Light, considering," Hugh replied. "Maybe 60, 70 dead. Twice that wounded. The Egyptians lost over 1,000, maybe more. They left their camp, their supplies, everything." The good knight looked toward the abandoned Fatimid camp, visible in the distance. Already Crusader soldiers were moving through it, looting what they could carry, burning the rest. It was the spoils of victory, the tangible reward for a day of suffering. But the good knight felt no desire to join them. He had seen enough, done enough. King Baldwin I was moving among his men, offering words of encouragement, checking on the wounded, ensuring that the army remained cohesive even in victory. The king's face was drawn, his movements stiff, but his presence was a stabilizing force. He had led from the front, had risked his life alongside his men, and that mattered. When Baldwin reached the good knight, he paused. The two men regarded each other for a moment. King and knight, commander and soldier. Two men who had survived a battle that could have ended the kingdom. "You held the flank," Baldwin said. It was not a question. "We held," the good knight replied. Baldwin nodded. "The Egyptians won't come back," Not like this, not with a field army. We've broken them. The good knight wanted to believe that, but he had been in Outremer long enough to know that victory was always temporary, that the struggle was never truly over. The Fatimids still held Ascalon. The Turks still controlled Damascus. The kingdom was still a fragile thing, held together by the discipline of its knights and the will of its king. But for today, they had won. And in Outremer, that was enough. The days following the Third Battle of Ramla were a blur of activity. The wounded were transported back to Jaffa and Jerusalem, where the limited medical facilities of the kingdom struggled to cope with the influx. The dead were buried in mass graves on the battlefield, their names recorded by the scribes who accompanied the army. The true cross was returned to Jerusalem in a solemn procession, carried through the streets to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where it would remain until the next crisis called it forth. The good knight remained with the army as it secured the region around Ramla. There were still Fatimid stragglers to be hunted down, supply lines to be established, and the ever-present threat of a counterattack to be guarded against. But the intensity of the immediate post-battle period gradually gave way to a more routine existence. He found himself thinking about the battle in the quiet moments, the way the Sudanese line had held longer than expected, the terror of the Turkish harassment, the brutal intimacy of the melee. He thought about the men who had died, both Crusader and Fatimid, and he wondered if their deaths had meant anything beyond the immediate tactical outcome. In the evenings, when the heat had faded and the camp was settling into the rhythms of night, the good knight would sit outside his tent and watch the stars. They were the same stars that had shone over Normandy, over Provence, over all the lands he had left behind when he took the cross. But they looked different here, sharper and more distant, as if the sky itself was foreign. He had been in Outremer for years now. He had fought in battles whose names he could barely remember, had seen cities fall and kingdoms rise, had watched men die for causes they barely understood, and through it all he had survived. But survival came at a cost. He could feel it in the stiffness of his joints, the scars that crisscrossed his body, the way his hands trembled sometimes when he thought no one was looking. He could feel it in the distance that had grown between himself and the man he had been before the First Crusade, before the long march through Anatolia, before the siege of Jerusalem. Fulcher of Chartres, the chronicler who had accompanied the First Crusade and who now lived in Jerusalem, had written something that the good knight had heard repeated in the taverns and halls of the kingdom. "We who were Occidentals have now become Orientals. He who was a Roman or a Frank has in this land been made into a Galilean or a Palestinian." The good knight understood what Fulcher meant. Outremer changed you. The heat, the violence, the constant proximity to death, it all left its mark. You could not remain the same person you had been. You adapted, or you died. And so the good knight had adapted. He had learned to fight in the desert, to endure the heat, to read the signs of an approaching sandstorm. He had learned the rhythms of the Muslim call to prayer, the taste of dates and figs, the way the light fell differently here than it did in Europe. He had learned to live in a land that was both holy and hostile, a place where every day was a test of faith and endurance. But he had not forgotten where he came from. He carried with him the memory of green fields and cool rain, of churches with stone walls and wooden roofs, of a world that seemed impossibly distant now. And sometimes, in the quiet moments, he wondered if he would ever see that world again. In the months following the Third Battle of Ramla, the strategic situation in the Levant began to shift. The Fatimid Caliphate, having lost 3 major battles at Ramla in as many years, abandoned its strategy of direct military confrontation. The annual raids continued, small, fast-moving forces that struck at Crusader settlements and then retreated before a response could be organized. But the days of large field armies marching on Jerusalem were over. Instead, the Fatimids focused their resources on fortifying Ascalon, the coastal fortress that remained their last major stronghold in the region. Ascalon became a thorn in the side of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a base from which raiders could strike at the southern frontier and a symbol of the incomplete nature of the Crusader conquest. But the threat from Ascalon was manageable. It was a nuisance, not an existential danger. And with the Fatimid threat neutralized, King Baldwin I was free to turn his attention to the north and the subsistence coast. The conquest of the coastal cities became the defining project of Baldwin's reign. Acre, Caesarea, Sidon. One by one, the ports fell to Crusader sieges, often with the assistance of Italian naval forces from Genoa, Pisa, and Venice. These cities were the lifeline of the kingdom, the points of contact with Europe, the sources of supplies and reinforcements. The GoodKnight participated in several of these sieges, though they were a different kind of warfare than the open battles he had fought at Ramla. Sieges were slow, grinding affairs, characterized by disease, starvation, and the constant threat of sallies from the defenders. They lacked the dramatic intensity of a cavalry charge, but they were no less deadly. During the siege of Acre in 1104, the GoodKnight spent weeks in the trenches, enduring the heat and the flies and the stench of the siege camp. He watched as the siege engines, massive trebuchets and mangonels, hurled stones at the city walls, slowly reducing them to rubble. He participated in the final assault, climbing the scaling ladders and fighting hand-to-hand on the battlements, and he was there when the city finally surrendered. Each victory brought the kingdom closer to stability, closer to the point where it could be considered a permanent fixture of the Levant rather than a temporary aberration. But the GoodKnight knew that stability was an illusion. The kingdom was always one bad battle away from collapse, always dependent on the arrival of new Crusaders from Europe, always vulnerable to the shifting alliances and ambitions of its Muslim neighbors. One of the lasting impacts of the Third Battle of Ramla was the evolution of Crusader military tactics. The presence of the Turkish horse archers had forced Baldwin I to adopt a more sophisticated approach to warfare, one that relied on combined arms coordination rather than simple cavalry charges. In the years following 1105, the Crusaders began to recruit more Turcopoles, light cavalry drawn from the indigenous Christian populations of the Levant, or from converted Muslims. These troops were trained to fight in the Turkish style, using composite bows and hit-and-run tactics, and they served as scouts and skirmishers for the main army. The GoodKnight, as a heavy cavalryman, initially viewed the Turcopoles with suspicion. They were not knights. They did not fight with the honor and discipline of the Frankish nobility, but he came to appreciate their value. The Turcopoles provided the intelligence and mobility that the heavy cavalry lacked. They were the eyes and ears of the army, the troops who could pursue a fleeing enemy or screen an advance. The integration of the Turcopoles into the Crusader military system was a sign of the kingdom's adaptation to its environment. The Franks were learning to fight like their enemies, to adopt the tactics and strategies that worked in the Levant rather than clinging to the methods that had worked in Europe. This process of adaptation was not without controversy. Some of the more conservative knights viewed the use of Turcopoles as a betrayal of Frankish identity, a sign that the Crusaders were becoming too much like the Muslims they had come to fight. But pragmatism won out. The kingdom needed every advantage it could get, and the Turcopoles provided an advantage. The GoodKnight, for his part, accepted the changes with the same stoic pragmatism that had carried him through years of warfare. He did not need to like the Turcopoles. He only needed to fight alongside them. And if they helped him survive, that was enough. The scar on his left forearm from the 1102 campaign, the dent in his helmet from a Turkish arrow at Ramla, the stiffness in his right shoulder from the impact of too many charges, the way his hands ached in the cold, though cold was a rare thing in the Levant. But the deeper scars were the ones that could not be seen. The nightmares that woke him in the middle of the night, visions of the melee at Ramla, of the faces of the men he had killed. The way he flinched at sudden noises, the instinctive reach for a weapon that was not there. The distance he felt from the other knights, the sense that he was watching the world from behind a wall of glass. He had become what Fulcher of Chartres had described, an Oriental, a man of the East, someone who had forgotten the places of his birth and had been remade by the land he now called home. He spoke Arabic well enough to bargain in the markets of Jerusalem. He had adopted the local custom of wearing lighter clothing beneath his armor. He had learned to appreciate the food, the music, the rhythms of life in a place that was both foreign and familiar. But he had not forgotten the cost. Every victory, every battle, every day of survival had been purchased with blood, his own and that of others. And he knew that the struggle was not over. It would never be over. The kingdom would always need men like him, men who were willing to stand on the walls and hold the line, men who could endure the heat and the violence and the slow erosion of the soul that came with a life of constant warfare. Chapter 11. The Legacy of Ramla. The Third Battle of Ramla became a defining moment in the history of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. It was the battle that proved the kingdom could survive, that the Crusaders were not a temporary phenomenon, but a permanent presence in the Levant. It was the battle that broke the Fatimid offensive capability and allowed the Franks to consolidate their hold on the coast. But for the men who fought there, it was something more personal. It was the day they had faced overwhelming odds and had not broken. It was the day they had proven to themselves and to their enemies that they were not going to be driven into the sea. The good knight carried the memory of that day with him for the rest of his life. He carried the weight of the charge, the chaos of the melee, the sight of the Sudanese line breaking, the sound of Baldwin's voice cutting through the din of battle. He carried the faces of the men who had died, both friend and foe, and the knowledge that he had survived when so many others had not. In the years that followed, he would fight in other battles, participate in other sieges, witness other victories and defeats. But Ramla remained the touchstone, the moment that defined what it meant to be a knight in Outremer. It was the moment when survival and victory had hung in the balance, and when discipline and faith had tipped the scales. The kingdom would endure for another 80 years, until the disaster at Hattin in 1187 brought it crashing down. But in 1105, on the plains of Ramla, the kingdom had been saved, and the good knight, bloodied and changed, had been there to see it. Epilogue. The Eternal Night. The good knight stood on the walls of Jerusalem, looking out over the city that had been the goal of the First Crusade, the prize that had cost so many lives. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and the call to prayer was echoing from the minarets that still stood in the Muslim quarters of the city. He was older now, his hair streaked with grey, his movements slower. But he was still here, still standing, still alive. He thought about the battles he had fought, the men he had known, the kingdom he had helped to build. He thought about Ramla, about the heat and the dust and the moment when everything had hung in the balance. He thought about the choices he had made, the things he had done, the price he had paid. And he wondered if it had been worth it. He did not have an answer. Perhaps there was no answer. Perhaps the question itself was meaningless. He had done what he had done, and he had survived. That was all. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the sky darkened. The good knight turned away from the wall and walked back into the city, his silver armor catching the last light of day. He had survived the Third Battle of Ramla. He had survived a decade in Outremer. And he would continue to survive, for as long as the kingdom needed him, for as long as there were battles to be fought and walls to be defended. Because that was what he was. That was what he had become. A knight. A survivor. A man who had been forged in the fires of the Levant, and who would carry the scars of that forging for the rest of his days. The good knight walked on into the gathering darkness, and the city closed around him like a familiar embrace. Our good knight will return. Subscribe for more.